The wind howled through the vast Montana territory as the first snow of the season began to fall. It wasn't a gentle snowfall. This was the kind that could bury a man in hours if he wasn't careful. Garrett Halloway, a 42-year-old rancher with a hard, weathered face, squinted into the storm as he rode along the edge of his property. His horse's hooves crunched in the snow as the old rancher moved slowly, searching for signs of trouble. He hadn't expected much more than a few lost cattle or stray wildlife. But what he saw next was something far different. A figure, barely visible through the falling snow, staggered toward him. A woman. She was hunched over, clutching something in her hands. Her breath came out in quick, ragged clouds, her body shaking from the cold. She was older, much older than any woman Garrett had ever known to travel this far out into the wilderness. She had the look of someone who had been running for a long time, and the blood on her sleeve didn't help her case. She must have been hurt. Garrett rode closer, his horse's large hooves making a soft crunch in the snow. When he was near enough, he called out to her, but she didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, as if she couldn't bear to look at him. He didn't know her, but there was something about her that struck him. She looked out of place, lost, as if the world had turned its back on her. And for a moment, Garrett wondered if it was just the storm playing tricks on his mind. "You need a home," Garrett said, his voice steady calm. The woman finally looked up, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "And my children need a grandmother." He paused. "But first, tell me why a woman your age is running in winter and why there's blood on your sleeve." Her eyes shifted uneasily, as if the question itself was a betrayal. She didn't answer right away, but Garrett saw the fear in her gaze, the kind that only came from running from something or someone. "I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go," she whispered, her voice thin and fragile, as if speaking took more strength than she had left. I didn't mean to end up here." The old rancher's expression softened. "Well, you're here now. It's my responsibility to make sure you don't freeze out here." Garrett dismounted and gently helped the woman onto his horse. He knew the journey back to the ranch would be slow, but he couldn't leave her to the storm. Her body was too frail, and the snow was falling heavier by the minute. As they slowly made their way back, Garrett's mind wandered to the children at the ranch. Emma, 16, who had taken on more than a daughter's share of responsibility since her mother died. Thomas, 12, quiet and withdrawn, who rarely spoke of his grief. And Grace, just 7, who had taken to talking to her dead mother as if she could hear her. The house was cold. The fire hadn't burned warm since Sarah's death. And Garrett knew that this woman, this stranger, might be the answer to a house that needed warmth, both in body and soul. When they reached the ranch house, Garrett called out to his children. They looked up from the hearth, where they'd been huddling for warmth, their faces tired and strained. "Emma, Thomas, Grace, I need you to come here and help," Garrett said, his voice commanding. The children reluctantly rose from their places, eyes glancing at the woman who was barely able to stay on her feet. "What is this?" Emma asked, her tone sharp as she stood at the door. Her gaze flicked to the woman, who was pale and trembling in Garrett's arms. "This is Eleanor Ashford," Garrett said, introducing the stranger. "She's going to stay with us for a while. She needs a place to rest, and I'm offering her room and board in exchange for helping out around the house." Emma raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "She's a stranger. We don't have room for strangers, Pop." "Emma," Garrett said sternly, his voice low, "she has nowhere else to go, and we need help. Winter's coming fast, and we can't afford to be picky." Grace, who had been standing quietly in the corner, looked at the woman with wide eyes. "Are you going to be our grandmother?" she asked, her voice filled with innocence. The words hung in the air, unspoken questions hanging between the two women. Eleanor, looked down at the little girl, her face softening for a moment, before she swallowed hard and nodded. "I guess I will be," she replied quietly. The woman was given a small room by the fire, where Garrett and Emma helped her settle in. After a hot drink, she looked up, her eyes scanning the room before turning back to Garrett. I, I don't have much to offer, she said, her voice fragile. But I can help, if you need me. Garrett nodded. We all need help, and we're all in this together now. As the evening stretched on and the snow continued to fall outside, the warmth of the house began to settle over the Halloway family, though the silence between them remained thick. There were so many questions unanswered, so many secrets yet to be revealed. And as Garrett lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this woman, this Eleanor Ashford, was running from something far darker than the winter storm. The sound of lanterns glowing in the distance interrupted his thoughts. It wasn't the wind that made his heart skip. It was the sight of riders moving across the snow-covered land, their lanterns bobbing in the night. They were searching for something or someone. Garrett's mind raced. Who was this woman? And what was she running from? Who was Eleanor Ashford? Where's she running from? Subscribe to find out. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor Ashford had arrived at the Halloway Ranch, and the heavy snowfall trapped them there, with no way in or out until spring. The storm seemed endless, but in its isolation, the atmosphere inside the house slowly began to shift. Eleanor, or Grandmother Nora, as Grace had taken to calling her, had transformed the house. The fire in the hearth roared every day. The smell of home-cooked meals filled the air, and laughter, which had been absent for so long, began to echo in the rooms. Nora had a way of making the house feel like it could breathe again. She taught Grace how to read, something the girl had been struggling with, and helped Thomas with his arithmetic, always with patience. Emma, too, softened, though she was still distant, still angry and hurt. But despite the friction, there were moments of peace. Nora played the old piano, the one that hadn't been touched since Sarah's death. The sound of the music brought a kind of joy to the house that no one had expected. One evening, after dinner, as Thomas shifted nervously in his chair, Nora noticed the boy's hand, swollen from an old knife wound. She insisted on treating it, and Garrett, curious, asked, "Where did you learn to stitch like that?" Nora's face tightened briefly, but she only said, "I was married to a doctor once. Learn a lot from him." Emma, who had been watching from the corner of the room, couldn't keep her resentment in check any longer. She burst out, "Stop pretending to be part of this family. We don't need you here." Her words were sharp, cutting through the warmth of the moment. Later that evening, after Emma had stormed off to the barn, Nora found her there, crying quietly. She sat beside her, not saying a word at first, but then she began to speak, her voice trembling with the weight of years. "I was married to a man who was a doctor. We studied medicine together, traveled the world, helping people. But when our daughter, Catherine, fell in love with a man named Victor Castellane, I couldn't stop her. And I should have." Nora's eyes clouded as she spoke. "I chose propriety over her safety, and it cost her life." She paused, the weight of the truth settling heavily between them. "Victor killed her. He took our granddaughter, and he sold her." Emma sat in stunned silence, absorbing the shock of Nora's confession. "What happened to the man? The one who killed her?" Emma asked softly, her voice shaky. "He's still out there," Nora replied, her voice low with fear. "And he's looking for me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Emma, despite her anger, began to see Nora not as a stranger, but as a woman who had been through unimaginable pain, and for the first time in a long while, she saw her as something close to family. As Christmas approached, for the first time in 2 years, the Halloway house seemed to come alive with the possibility of joy. The children began to believe in Christmas again, decorating the tree and singing carols around the fire. But as they worked together, preparing for the holiday, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone somewhere was closing in. He knew that Nora's past had followed her here, and the threat it carried would soon make itself known. When Garrett went to town with Thomas the next day, he ran into a well-dressed stranger at the general store, asking too many questions about an elderly woman who had recently arrived in the area. The man was polite, but his eyes were cold, his questions probing. He mentioned an inheritance dispute and offered a reward for information. Garrett lied. Haven't seen anyone like that. But the feeling of unease grew stronger as he made his way back to the ranch. He knew that the stranger was connected to Nora's past, and now the past was catching up with her. That evening, as Garrett sat down to dinner with his children, he could see the worry in their eyes. They too felt the growing tension, but he had no choice but to lie again, telling them that it was nothing. Yet, as they all sat together, the thought that someone was still hunting Nora lingered in his mind. "He's found you," Garrett said softly to Nora that night, his voice full of dread. "The hunter is closing in. Will Nora run or stay and fight?" The night was still and quiet as the family gathered around the fireplace, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Garrett sat in a chair, his eyes fixed on Nora, who sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The weight of the past had been pressing on her for weeks now, and with each passing day, she could feel the burden of the secrets she had carried for so long growing heavier. The children had grown close to her, especially Grace, who clung to her like a lifeline, calling her grandmother Nora without hesitation. But Nora knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. It was time to tell them everything. She cleared her throat, and Garrett, sensing something was different, leaned forward slightly. "You've been kind to me," Nora began softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "And for that, I'm grateful. But there's something you all need to know, something I've been hiding for too long." The room seemed to hold its breath, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls as the children turned their full attention to her. Nora looked at them, her eyes full of regret. "I'm not who I told you I am. My name is Dr. Eleanor Ashford, and I was once a physician in St. Louis." She paused, feeling the sting of those old memories. "I practiced medicine for over 30 years, helping the sick, delivering babies, doing what I could to make the world a better place. But my life, the one I thought I understood, shattered when my daughter, Catherine, fell in love with a man named Victor Castellane." Nora's voice grew quieter as she continued. "Victor was charming, wealthy, and powerful. He had the kind of charisma that made people trust him. But beneath that charm, he was a monster. A dangerous man who had a dark secret." Nora's hands tightened on her lap as she recalled the horrors she had uncovered. Victor was running an illegal adoption ring. He was buying babies from desperate women, from the poor, and selling them to rich families who couldn't have children of their own. He falsified birth certificates. He doctored death records. It was all a lie. But I found out. I uncovered everything. I confronted Catherine with what I had learned, hoping she would see the truth. Her voice cracked as she spoke her daughter's name. But she wouldn't believe me. She chose him over me. She married him, and I lost her. The room was silent, save for the soft crackling of the fire. Emma, who had been listening intently, blinked away the tears that threatened to fall. "What happened to the baby?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nora's face twisted in grief. "Catherine died in childbirth. Victor claimed the baby was stillborn, but I don't believe it. I believe he killed that child, too. He wanted to punish me for daring to stand in his way." Nora stood up abruptly, walking over to the window and staring out into the darkness. "I spent years after that trying to get justice. I gathered evidence, pieces of the puzzle. I knew what he was doing, and I knew that if I could prove it, if I could expose him, it would end his empire. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He had too many people in his pocket, judges, politicians, lawmen. So he had me declared mentally incompetent. They tried to have me locked away in an asylum, but I escaped, and I've been running ever since." She turned back to face Garrett and the children, her expression full of pain. "I thought I could outrun him, that I could keep going until I was safe. But now, I know he'll never stop looking for me. He wants to make sure I never testify. He can't let the truth come out, or everything he's built will come crashing down." Garrett stood up, his jaw clenched as he took in her words. "So, what are we supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice steady but full of concern. Nora, shook her head. I don't know. I didn't mean to bring this trouble to your doorstep. I've already caused enough harm. Emma stood up, her eyes red from the tears she had shed in silence. You didn't bring this on us. We're not turning you away, she said, her voice fierce with resolve. You're our family now. You've done more for us in 2 weeks than anyone else has done in 2 years. The words seemed to settle over the room like a blanket, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the house didn't feel so cold. Thomas, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his expression serious for a boy of his age. We'll protect you, he said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. No one is going to hurt you while we're here. Nora looked at the children, her heart swelling with gratitude and guilt. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. If Victor finds me, he'll hurt all of you. He has too many people working for him. You can't protect me. Garrett walked over to her, his gaze steady. We don't run. We stand and fight. He turned to Emma. We need to get the evidence you've been hiding to someone who can help. There's a retired federal judge in Helena. He's one of the few men in the world who can't be bought. If we can get the evidence to him, we can put Victor behind bars for good. Emma nodded, her face set with a determination that mirrored Garrett's. We'll make sure it gets there. We'll do whatever it takes. Nora wiped away the tears that had escaped down her cheeks. I never wanted to be a burden. I never wanted to drag you all into this. Garrett placed a hand on her shoulder. You're not a burden, Nora. You're family, and we take care of family. As Christmas approached, the Halloway ranch began to feel like a home again, filled with the sounds of laughter and hope. But Garrett knew that the peace they had found would not last. Victor Castellane would stop at nothing to silence Nora, and he would come for her no matter the cost. That night, as Garrett lay in bed, he heard the sound of riders in the distance, their lanterns bobbing through the storm. He knew it wouldn't be long before they reached the ranch. Nora's past had caught up with her, and the storm they had all been trying to outrun was closing in fast. Victor's men are closing in. Will the Halloway family be able to protect Nora? The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a blanket of white snow covering the land, the chill in the air biting as the wind howled through the trees. Garrett stood at the front of the ranch house, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sky was clear, but something in the air told him the calm would not last. The storm of trouble they had all been bracing for was closing in. They had known this day would come, the day when the past would finally catch up to Nora, when the hunters would arrive. And sure enough, as the day wore on, Garrett spotted riders in the distance. But as he squinted into the snowy expanse, he realized something wasn't quite right. The riders weren't Victor's men. Not yet, at least. He could tell by their slow pace, the way they moved, their posture. They weren't coming for Nora, at least not immediately. As the riders drew closer, Garrett began to feel a slight sense of relief, but it was short-lived. He moved quickly to intercept them, his heart pounding with unease. He called out to them, and as they approached, he could see that they were just neighboring ranchers seeking shelter from the blizzard. Garrett breathed a quiet sigh of relief, though it did little to ease the tension that had been building in his chest. They were still far from safe, and he knew it. After a brief exchange, Garrett invited the men to stay in the barn until the storm passed. There was no point in sending them away into the cold when they could offer some help in the meantime. But the entire time, Garrett's mind remained fixed on the impending danger. The neighbors would be a welcome distraction, but he knew that sooner or later, Victor Castellane would come for them. After the men settled in the barn, Garrett returned to the house, where Nora was in the kitchen, preparing a warm meal for everyone. Grace, her small face full of excitement, was helping her, her chatter filling the room. Nora, who had become an unexpected source of warmth in the house, smiled gently at the girl. For the first time in a long while, the house felt alive with the stirrings of joy. But Garrett couldn't shake the heavy feeling in his chest. The danger hadn't passed, not by a long shot. That night, as everyone settled in for bed, Grace had a nightmare. Her cries echoed through the house, waking Garrett Nora, and Emma. The little girl was sobbing in her bed, her tiny hands clutching the sheets. Nora was the first to reach her, pulling her into her arms and whispering soothing words. The nightmare had rattled her, but Nora, with a tenderness that seemed to come so naturally to her, comforted Grace, holding her close. "Will you leave like Mama did?" Grace asked, her voice trembling with fear. Nora's heart broke at the question, the child's innocent fear cutting through her. She paused for a moment, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "No, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here to stay." Garrett stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold before him. He had always known that being a father wasn't easy, but seeing Nora, a woman who had been through so much pain, comfort his daughter so effortlessly was a reminder of how much this family needed her. As Nora calmed Grace down, Garrett stepped outside into the cold night air. He needed to think, needed to clear his mind. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he paced back and forth. The wind bit at his skin, but the chill he felt in his heart was far worse. The stakes had never been higher, and with every passing moment, the feeling of dread grew. After a while, Emma joined him outside, her breath visible in the frigid air. She didn't say anything at first, but Garrett could see the worry in her eyes. She, too, knew that things were about to change. "Pa," Emma finally spoke, her voice soft. "I've been thinking about what we should do." "About Nora." Garrett turned to look at her, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. "I know, Emma. I'm doing everything I can to protect her, but I don't know if it's enough." Emma's voice was steady, though the fear behind her words was palpable. "She's not just a stranger anymore. She's our family, and we can't let him take her. We have to stand and fight. You've always told us to protect the people we love." Garrett took a deep breath, the cold air seeping into his lungs. "I know," he said, his voice quiet, "but fighting isn't always as easy as it sounds. Victor won't back down. He has too many people, too much power." Emma shook her head. "He can't win. Not if we all stand together." Her words, though simple, held a power that Garrett couldn't ignore. She was right. They had to protect Nora. They couldn't let Victor take her, not after everything she had done for them. As the night stretched on, the storm grew fiercer, and the sound of the wind outside seemed to intensify, matching the anxiety that Garrett felt in his chest. He knew that the moment would come when Victor would show up at the ranch, demanding Nora's surrender. And when he did, Garrett would be ready. Christmas Eve morning arrived with a bitter chill in the air, the sun barely visible through the clouds. The storm hadn't let up, and the snow piled higher by the hour. But it was not the storm outside that had everyone on edge. It was the arrival of an elegant horse-drawn carriage that caused a ripple of tension to pass through the Halloway family. Garrett was the first to see it, his gaze fixed on the gleaming wheels as they approached the ranch house. The carriage was a stark contrast to the rugged surroundings, and Garrett's heart sank as he recognized the figure stepping out. Victor Castellane, immaculately dressed, with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. He stepped down from the carriage with the grace of a man who had everything, a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked like a predator, his presence alone enough to make the hairs on the back of Garrett's neck stand on end. "Dr. Ashford," Victor called, his voice smooth and charming as he approached the house. "Your family is worried. You've been unwell." He glanced at the children, who stood frozen by the door. "These delusions, symptoms of mental decline, I'm afraid." Nora's face grew pale at his words, but she stood her ground. Garrett, too, stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "She's not going anywhere, Castellane," Garrett said firmly. Victor, his smile never wavering, raised a hand as if to calm the situation. "I'm just concerned for her well-being. Let me take her for proper care. It's what's best for everyone, don't you think?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a set of legal papers, the kind that had the power to change everything. "I have here commitment papers signed by 2 doctors. Under territorial law, I have the authority to take her. Emma, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward, her voice steady but determined. "You're not taking her anywhere." With a quick motion, she pulled out a set of papers from her pocket and held them up for Victor to see. "She's not sick. She's a witness." She started reading aloud the names, dates, and payments for the babies, the illegal adoptions that Victor had been running. Victor's facade cracked, his charming smile faltering as he heard his empire being exposed. His eyes darkened with rage, and he lunged toward Emma. But Garrett was quicker, his hand reaching for his rifle, ready to defend his family. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed like the world would explode into chaos. Victor's men, who had been standing in the background, began to move, their hands hovering near their weapons. Garrett's heart raced, and he knew this was it, the moment of confrontation. As the situation teetered on the edge of violence, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Garrett's eyes widened as he saw a rider approaching at a fast pace. It wasn't one of Victor's men. It was the sheriff, a man who had been Garrett's friend for years. The sheriff had received word of the standoff and had come to help, just as Garrett had hoped. "Hold on, Victor," the sheriff called, his voice loud and commanding as he rode in. "I know you, and I know your game. You're under arrest." Victor froze, his expression one of disbelief. "What do you mean, under arrest?" Victor sneered, but the sheriff was undeterred. "You've been caught, Victor. Your game is over." With that, the sheriff threw down a federal warrant for Victor's arrest. The moment had come. Victor Castellane's empire was falling apart, and Garrett and his family were about to find out just how far they were willing to go to protect Nora and her truth. The confrontation has begun. Will Nora and her family survive Victor's wrath? The tension was unbearable as Victor Castellane stood before them, his cold, calculating eyes locked onto Garrett and the children. The sheriff's arrival had only momentarily halted the standoff, but the air was still thick with the threat of violence. Garrett's rifle was aimed steadily at Victor's chest, but he knew that the situation was rapidly escalating. Victor's men, who had remained motionless until now, were preparing to draw their weapons, their hands twitching with barely contained aggression. The time for talking was over. The fate of Nora, and perhaps the entire Halloway family, hung in the balance. Victor, though, wasn't one to back down easily. His mouth twisted into a sneer, the smile that had once been charming now replaced by sheer menace. "You're making a big mistake, Halloway," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Let her go now, and I'll forget this ever happened. Refuse, and I'll make sure you regret it." The man's arrogance was palpable, but it wasn't enough to intimidate Garrett. "We're not giving her up, Castellane," Garrett said, his voice unwavering. "Not now, not ever." Emma stood beside him, her eyes fierce with the same defiance. She had watched Nora struggle for so long, watched as the woman who had become their grandmother had fought to stay, fought to live a life that had been stolen from her. Emma wouldn't let that fight be in vain. Nora, who had been standing behind the children, was suddenly at the forefront, her face pale and full of anguish. She looked at Garrett, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Please, Garrett," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me go. It's the only way to save them." Her words were soft but heavy with years of guilt and fear. "I've already brought too much danger to your doorstep. If I stay, they'll kill you all." Garrett's heart clenched as he looked at her. He understood her pain, her desire to protect them, but he couldn't let her sacrifice herself for the sake of his family. Not after everything they had been through together. "No, Nora," he said firmly, stepping forward. "You're not going anywhere." But Nora only shook her head, her gaze filled with resignation. "You don't understand," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I've already lived my life. You and the children still have a chance at happiness. If I leave now, maybe you'll have a future." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Garrett knew she was right. She had spent 30 years running, hiding from the ghosts of her past, and now that she had finally found a family, She was willing to give it all up to protect them. Nora was prepared to die for them, and that kind of selflessness tore at Garrett's heart. He couldn't let her do that. He wouldn't let her. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself," Garrett said softly, his voice low and desperate. "You've already given us everything. You've brought life back into this house. We're not losing you now." But Nora only smiled sadly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You don't know what it's like, Garrett," she whispered, "to live with the kind of guilt I carry. To know that my own daughter died because of me. To know that I could have saved her, and I didn't." Her voice faltered, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Nora seemed to break. The wall she had built around herself came crumbling down, and the weight of her grief poured out in a steady stream. Garrett stepped forward and took her hands, his grip firm and steady. "You didn't kill her, Nora," he said gently, his voice filled with a tenderness he hadn't shown in years. "You did everything you could to protect her, and you've spent your life trying to make things right. But none of this is your fault." Nora looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Garrett saw a flicker of something. Hope, maybe deep in her gaze. It was fleeting, but it was there. "Please," Garrett said again, his voice steady. "We're not going to lose you. Not now. Not ever." Emma, who had been standing quietly beside them, suddenly spoke up, her voice strong and resolute. "You don't have to go, Grandma," she said, her eyes filled with fierce protectiveness. "We're not going to let him hurt you." Nora turned to face her, her heart aching with the love she felt for the children. Emma was right. She didn't have to go. She had already found a family, one that loved her, one that would fight for her. "I can't," Nora whispered, shaking her head. "I've spent so long running, I don't know how to stop." Garrett's voice was filled with determination as he looked at her. "Then stop running. Stay with us. We'll fight for you, and we'll win." For a moment, Nora hesitated, the weight of her past holding her back, but then she finally nodded, a quiet resolve settling over her. "I'll stay," she said, her voice firm. "But we have to make sure we're ready. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." The air was thick with anticipation as the family prepared for what was to come. Nora had made her decision, and now they all had to be ready to face Victor and his men. Garrett knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that they were stronger together. It was time to fight, time to protect the woman who had saved them in so many ways. That evening, as the snow continued to fall outside, the family gathered in the warmth of the living room, preparing for the battle ahead. Thomas, the quiet boy who had never spoken much about his emotions, suddenly stood up, his face serious. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady. "We can't just let him take her. We need to be ready." Garrett turned to him, surprised by his words. "What do you mean, son?" Thomas walked over to the fireplace and picked up a small axe. "We can defend this place," he said quietly. "We can fight back." Garrett looked at his son, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he saw the strength that had been growing inside Thomas. He wasn't just a quiet boy anymore. He was a part of this family's fight, a protector in his own right. "You're right, Thomas," Garrett said, his voice full of pride. "We will fight. We'll protect Nora, and we'll protect this family. We'll make sure they don't take you from us." The next few hours were spent preparing for the confrontation that was sure to come. Garrett and the children worked together to fortify the house, making sure that every entrance was secure. They were ready, but as the hours passed, the tension in the air only grew heavier. It was Christmas Eve, and yet all they could think about was the storm that was brewing outside, the danger that loomed ever closer. As midnight approached, a faint sound broke through the stillness of the night. A distant rumble of hooves on the frozen ground. The riders were coming, and they weren't alone. Victor Castellane was closing in. The time for waiting was over. They would either stand and fight, or they would lose everything. Garrett stood at the window, watching as the snowflakes fell outside, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. He knew that the next few moments would change everything. And when he turned to face his family, He knew they were ready. They had made their choice. The battle is coming. Will the Halloway family survive the fight for Nora's freedom? The wind howled outside, but inside the Halloway ranch, there was a warmth that had long been missing. It was Christmas Eve, but it felt like a different kind of holiday, a kind born from survival, from love, from the unshakable bond of family. Nora sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the weight of the past still pressing down on her shoulders. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something other than guilt. It had been a long road to get here, to this point of tentative peace, but as she looked around at the faces of the children, at Garrett, who had shown her a kind of love she thought she'd lost forever, she knew that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. Garrett had stood by her side through the storm. He had offered her protection when she had nothing to give in return. The children had accepted her without hesitation, without question, and in doing so, they had given her something she hadn't had in decades, a family. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Grace, still too young to fully understand the dangers they had faced, sat at Nora's feet, playing with a doll that Garrett had carved for her. The sound of Grace's laughter filled the room, a reminder of everything they had fought to protect. Thomas, who had grown into a quiet strength over the past few weeks, sat near the window, looking out into the snowy night. His expression was thoughtful, but there was a calmness about him now, a peace that hadn't been there before. Emma was in the corner, her hands busy with a small piece of embroidery. She glanced up occasionally, meeting Nora's gaze with an understanding that went beyond words. The tension that had once divided them had finally begun to fade, replaced by something more solid: respect, affection, and perhaps even love in its own quiet way. Garrett, as usual, was the last to speak. He sat in his usual chair by the fire, his eyes thoughtful as he looked at the family they had become. The ranch had once been a place of grief and cold silence, but now it was a home full of life, of laughter, and most importantly, of love. "We've made it this far," Garrett said quietly, his voice full of emotion, "and we'll make it the rest of the way together. No more running, no more hiding." Nora's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had spent so many years running, afraid of the past, afraid of the truth. But now, as the weight of that truth finally lifted, she realized that she no longer needed to run. She could face the future with the people who had become her family, the people who had chosen her. The sound of horses' hooves broke through the stillness of the night. But this time, it wasn't the sound of danger approaching. It was the sound of safety. Garrett stood up, his face set in determination, and Nora followed him to the door. The snow was still falling, but it was quieter now, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The riders who approached weren't the hunters they had feared. They were the federal marshals, led by Judge Morrison. The man who had once been a distant hope was now a reality. His presence a sign that justice was finally within reach. Garrett stepped forward to meet them, his hand on a rifle at his side, just in case. But when he saw Judge Morrison's face, his tense posture relaxed. The marshal's men were positioned in a loose formation, ready to move at a moment's notice. "Garrett Halloway," Judge Morrison called out, his voice calm and firm. "It's good to see you again." Garrett nodded, his face hardening with resolve. "You're just in time," he said. "Victor Castellane's been after Nora for too long. He's not going to let her go without a fight." The sheriff, who had arrived with the marshal's men, looked up at Garrett. "It's done, Halloway," he said quietly. "We've got everything in place. Victor's people are being rounded up as we speak." Garrett felt a sense of relief wash over him, though it didn't last long. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. They still had to see this through, still had to make sure that justice was served. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. The family could breathe again. And as they stood there, in the glow of the firelight, Garrett turned to Nora, who had been silent through it all. She was no longer the broken woman who had stumbled onto his ranch weeks ago. She was strong now, stronger than she had ever been, and Garrett saw something new in her eyes: peace. "I didn't think I could ever feel this again," Nora whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd lost it forever." Garrett smiled, though there was sadness in his eyes. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. "We'll protect you, Nora. You've saved us in more ways than you'll ever know." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Thomas's voice. He had stepped forward, his expression serious. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady. "We can't let this happen again. We can't let people like Victor do what they want. We have to stop them." Emma, who had been standing quietly beside him, nodded. "We can't let the past define us anymore," she said. "We have a future to build, together." Nora looked at them both, her heart swelling with pride. "You're right," she said quietly. "We have a future now, and I'm going to be here to see it." The sound of the door opening interrupted their moment, and Garrett turned to find Sheriff Montgomery entering the house, his face grim. "It's over," the sheriff said, his voice low. "Victor Castellane's men have been arrested. They're headed for trial. The adoption ring is destroyed." Nora's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of release. She had spent so many years running, so many years hiding from the truth, but now it was over. Victor Castellane's empire had fallen. The people he had destroyed were finally getting justice. And Nora, after all these years, was free. The family gathered around her, their arms around her, their voices full of warmth and love. They weren't just protecting her anymore. They were welcoming her home. As the snow continued to fall outside, the fire inside crackled and popped, casting shadows across the room. The family that had once been broken, divided, was now whole. And as they stood together, they knew that they had found something that no one could ever take from them: each other. The children, the ranch, and Nora. This was home. And Nora, for the first time in years, believed it. The sacrifices had been made. The past had been buried. Now, they had a future to look forward to. And as Garrett looked at her, his voice filled with quiet emotion, he said, "You're home now, Nora. You've always had a place with us." Nora smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "This is where I belong." The family, the chosen family, stood together as one, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together they could overcome anything. Nora has found a family, and the Halloways have found their strength. If you believe in second chances, subscribe for more stories of courage, redemption, and the power of family.